very much to you and the team for the invite. The humanitarian situation right now in Gaza is absolutely catastrophic. Since the 2nd of March, Gaza has been under a full blockade. That means that all border crossings are closed, both for humanitarian and also for commercial trucks, and that no food, water, medicine, fuel, or any other essential supplies are entering Gaza. Only in the last couple of weeks, the Israeli authorities have allowed only a select number of UN agencies and INGOs to resume the delivery of a very limited amount of aid in Gaza, primarily food items, health supplies, and water purification items. But this is, of course, a drop in the ocean. The reality is that today almost 500,000 people in Gaza are facing catastrophic hunger, and the entire population is experiencing acute food insecurity. The Israeli authorities, as you might have heard from the news, have contracted the so called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is a new
Yeah.
entity registered in the US and in Switzerland, primarily managed by former US military
Mhm.
personnel, to handle the provision of humanitarian aid to the population, which consists exclusively of a very limited amount of food items. But what we have seen so far is that this system is simply a death trap, a sadistic human abattoir, if we want to use the word by Francesca Albanese, the UN rapporteur for the Palestinian territories. It is simply a very humiliating system which is forcing exhausted civilians to risk their lives and walk for miles and miles to receive only a trickle of aid under extremely unsafe conditions and in complete disregard with the humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, independence, and neutrality.
Mhm.
In fact, since the establishment of the two distribution sites, almost 200 Palestinians have already lost their lives and more than 500 have been injured just in the desperate attempt to get some food for themselves and their families. And the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has warned against what we call the weaponization of humanitarian aid, has also called for an immediate and independent investigations into these events and for the perpetrators to be held accountable. So the dire reality nowadays is that families in Gaza are starving while tons and tons of food is lying at the border, just sitting at the border, and the
Mhm.
Israeli authorities are simply blocking the entry of essential humanitarian aid. So there is absolutely an urgent need to increase the pressure on the Israeli government to restore the distribution of humanitarian aid through the UN and other NGOs that have knowledge of the territory and the population and can provide the humanitarian assistance in a way which is effective and dignified.
Mhm. The pictures coming from those distributions are absolutely terrifying of Israeli shooting basically towards people who are desperate to get any food, super small rations. It seems like they feel like they did something, so now the discussion can be almost closed. But it also proves that you have to know how to deliver humanitarian aid. You cannot do this like wild west there. It's absolutely terrifying how those food lines look like, with hundreds, thousands of desperate people. We saw some news reports of people who said they've been walking for like 4 hours just to be there for the opening of the line, to be informed that the food is already gone. And we're talking about families, children, right?
Absolutely.
The situation, how you described it, we were wondering, all in the studios, how much different is this specific situation right now in Gaza from other conflict zones you worked in?
Sonia, the reality is that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is completely different from any other conflict zone. What is happening in Gaza is not a conventional war where the parties to the conflict abide to at least some international law and international humanitarian law standards. What is happening in Gaza is a genocide. Since the beginning of the conflict, the civilians and the civilian infrastructure have been repeatedly and systematically targeted. We know that over 60,000 civilians, the large majority, almost 60%, were women and children, were killed. And the figure is just an underestimate. Many experts, including the very famous Lancet magazines, have estimated that approximately 200,000 civilians have lost their lives. And this estimate includes not only those killed directly by bombardment, but also those who died due to indirect causes such as malnutrition, lack of access to medical care for the severely injured or the chronically ill, and an estimated 10,000 civilians still trapped under the rubble whose bodies could not be recovered simply because there are no equipment, because the Israeli authorities have systematically blocked the entry of equipment to remove the rubble. The reality is that over 90% of the population is displaced. The majority of civilians have been displaced multiple times. The evacuation orders arrive just a few minutes before the Israeli Defense Forces start bombing civilian areas. And the entire population, when they escape, they just go and live in unbearable conditions in overcrowded shelters, makeshift camps, dilapidated buildings without any access to essential services. The very lucky ones who still live in the very few flats available in Gaza, they share a very limited space with 30, 40 other people, members of the extended families, neighbors. The strip also doesn't exist anymore. It has been almost completely destroyed. More than 80% of residential buildings have been destroyed. More than 80% of schools have been destroyed. 85% of hospitals have been destroyed. 100% of universities, all the 12 universities in Gaza were destroyed. Mosque, archaeological sites, Gaza does not exist anymore. It is a pile of rubble. Even the agricultural land has been severely damaged and destroyed. Over 80% of agricultural land have been completely destroyed. And that makes the civilian population completely dependent on humanitarian aid. So, what is happening in Gaza is simply a systematic, very well planned annihilation of human lives. It is not a conventional conflict. It is the total destruction, brick by brick, child by child, of an entire population, of its land and its culture.
Those absolute horrifying pictures of people trying to buy any food on the street, buying like a half-rotten tomato almost, and the price of basic veggies went 15 times up. It's absolutely terrifying and incredible that the situation is only getting worse and worse. And I have to ask you about something very disturbing that you reported on. You said that children in Gaza are often targeted similarly to military objectives. Objects. I would like you to elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's important that we look at the demographics. Gaza has a very young population. Approximately 50% of the population of Gaza is under 18 years of age, so it's constituted by children. So it goes without saying that when areas which are densely populated by civilians are bombed and nothing is done to prevent harm to civilians, it is inevitable that many children die or remain severely injured or suffer the loss of family members. Children in Gaza have been repeatedly targeted since the beginning of the genocide. More than 18,000 have been killed, more than 30,000 have been injured, including with life changing injuries that cause permanent disabilities. And according to UN sources, Gaza also has the largest number of amputee children in modern history. And several surgeons, both the Palestinians and foreign nationals who are working and volunteering in hospitals, have reported to have seen or treated children with gunshot wounds to the head and the chest. And these are injuries which are not typically associated with crossfire or collapsing buildings, but with targeted shooting. So it is clear that the Israeli government has never even attempted to protect the children, despite the international humanitarian law is very clear, is crystal clear, and gives to the occupying power to responsibility not only to protect the civilians and children, but also the full responsibility to facilitate the proper working of all institutions devoted to the care and education of children. This is Article 50 of the Fourth Geneva Convention on the protection of civilians in situations of armed conflict. So it is without any doubt a war on children, a war on their childhood, and a war on their future.
This was one of our summer shorts, meaning a short episode that is part of a larger one that we recorded during season 4. So if you're interested in this topic, you can learn much more by checking the full episode, and we will put a link to it in the show notes. And one more thing. ReFOCUS is part of a very big campaign called Where We Rise. It's us plus 29 other organizations that are trying to raise 1 million euros, yes, ambitiously, within 2 months for a grassroots organization movement. We are trying to do it for people on the move, people we supported for years, some of us decades, in Greece, in the Balkans. So if you can, please consider supporting this donation, this fundraiser. We will put all the links in the show notes. And please believe us when we say that any donation matters. It doesn't matter if it's €1 or €1,000. It will really go to a very noble cause.